It started like so many Hollywood stories do, with flashing cameras, a red carpet, and a name that had once meant success. In the early 2000s, Robert Blake was a respected actor, known for his roles in Cold Blood and Beretta. He was the kind of celebrity who'd earned both critical acclaim and public affection. But fame is a fragile thing, and sometimes what happens when the cameras stop rolling can turn admiration into horror. Robert Blake met Bonnie Lee Bakley in 1999. She was a woman with a past as colorful as it was controversial, known for her relationships with famous men and her reputation as someone chasing status and money. Theirs was a strange match, and from the beginning, friends noticed the tension. Bonnie was persistent, even manipulative at times, while Blake, decades her senior, seemed torn between affection and distrust. When she gave birth to a daughter and claimed Robert was the father, he reluctantly married her, though privately, he questioned whether the child was really his. Their marriage was brief and troubled. Neighbors described arguments that could be heard through the walls, and Blake often complained about Bonnie's behavior. Still, they were seen dining together on the night of May 4, 2001, at Vitello's, an Italian restaurant in Studio City. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, dinner, a quiet drive home, but it ended with a gunshot in a dark alley. When Blake returned to the restaurant minutes after walking Bonnie to his car, he told staff that he'd forgotten his gun inside. When he came back outside again, Bonnie was slumped in the passenger seat, dead from a single bullet wound to the head. The police were called, and soon the parking lot was a scene of flashing blue lights and camera lenses. Blake stood nearby, stunned, as reporters and investigators swarmed. At first, it seemed like the tragic death of a celebrity's wife in a dangerous neighborhood. But investigators quickly realized that something didn't add up. The gun Blake claimed to have left behind, the one he said he went back for, was not the murder weapon. And the way Bonnie was killed suggested something personal, not random. Over the following months, detectives began uncovering a web of strange details. Blake's relationship with Bonnie was full of resentment. He had allegedly spoken to two stuntmen friends about helping him get rid of her, though both later claimed they refused. The weapon used, an old revolver, was traced to a collector, and it matched the type Blake was known to carry. By 2002, Robert Blake was arrested and charged with murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation of murder. The media frenzy was immediate. The image of the actor who once charmed millions now stood beside headlines that read, "Beretta star accused of killing wife." Every major network carried the story. Every newspaper dissected his motives. The trial began in 2005, and what unfolded was pure courtroom drama. Blake's defense claimed the police had botched the investigation, that there was no physical evidence tying him to the shooting, and that witnesses were unreliable. The prosecution painted a darker picture, a man trapped in a toxic marriage who saw no other way out. After months of testimony and national speculation, the verdict came, not guilty of murder and conspiracy. Blake wept openly in court, while Bonnie's family stared in disbelief. But while he walked free from criminal charges, his troubles weren't over. In a subsequent civil trial, a jury found him liable for Bonnie's wrongful death and ordered him to pay $30 million in damages, later reduced to $15 million. By the end of it all, Robert Blake was a free man in name but not in spirit. His reputation was destroyed. He filed for bankruptcy, withdrew from public life, and became a symbol of how fame can curdle into tragedy. Those who saw him later described him as haunted, not just by the accusations, but by the loss of everything he once had. Years passed. Interviews showed a man who still denied any wrongdoing but couldn't escape the shadow of that night outside Vitello's. He said he'd been broken by the system, that the trial stole his career and his peace. But for many, the question never really went away. Did Robert Blake kill his wife? Or was he simply the unlucky centerpiece of a scandal built for the cameras? The answer died quietly with him in 2023. Even in death, opinions remained divided. Some called him a victim of circumstance, others a murderer who escaped justice. Hollywood moved on, as it always does. The restaurant where Bonnie was shot changed hands and remodeled, but people still whispered about it. Tourists sometimes stopped by, pointing out the exact spot where it happened, lowering their voices as if the air still carried the echo of that gunshot. For those who remember, it's not just the story of a fallen celebrity, it's a chilling reminder that fame can't shield you from consequence. and love can turn lethal when trust has already died. Lindsay Lohan's story wasn't written in blood like some others on this list, but it remains one of the most haunting descents from stardom into chaos. Hers was the face of early 2000s Hollywood, the child actress who grew up before our eyes. From The Parent Trap to Mean Girls to red carpets, interviews and pop songs that made her seem unstoppable. But behind the glitz, Lindsay was drowning in a culture that thrives on youth, fame, and excess. And by the time the world realized how far she'd fallen, the girl who once lit up screens had become a cautionary tale. Her troubles began quietly. She was barely out of her teens when she started frequenting Los Angeles clubs, places where the music never stopped and no one asked for IDs if you were famous. Paparazzi captured her stumbling out of cars, surrounded by bodyguards, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. She brushed off the rumors of drinking and drugs, telling interviewers she was fine, just tired, just overworked. But the first arrest came in 2007, and from that moment, her life would never again belong to her. On May 26th of that year, Lindsay crashed her Mercedes-Benz on Sunset Boulevard. Police found cocaine in the car. It wasn't much, a small amount tucked into a folded paper, but it was enough to add possession charges to the DUI she'd already earned. She was booked, photographed, and released on bail. Within weeks, the mugshot of the once beloved starlet was on every screen in America. But what made it worse was how quickly it happened again. Only 2 months later, in July, she was pulled over after a car chase involving the mother of her former assistant. Another DUI, another cocaine possession charge. This time, she also faced driving with a suspended license and bringing a controlled substance into a police station. It was chaos. The tabloids fed on it, and her fall from grace became entertainment. In August 2007, she pleaded guilty to misdemeanor cocaine use and DUI. The sentence was light: 1 day in jail, 10 days of community service, 3 years probation, and mandatory rehab. But Lindsay's problem wasn't the law, it was herself. Addiction doesn't follow court orders, and Hollywood doesn't forgive weakness. What followed was a carousel of relapses, arrests, and broken promises. In 2010, she missed mandatory alcohol education classes. A judge issued a warrant for her arrest. She spent 14 days in jail, less than expected due to overcrowding, then returned to rehab. Each time she emerged, she promised to change, and for a brief moment, the world wanted to believe her. But then another headline would appear: Lohan violates probation, Lohan charged with theft, Lohan sent back to jail. By 2011, she'd been in and out of court so many times that her career was effectively over. One of the most infamous incidents came that year, when she was accused of stealing a $2,500 necklace from a boutique in Venice, California. Security footage showed her trying it on, smiling, then leaving without paying. Her lawyer called it a misunderstanding, but prosecutors weren't convinced. She was sentenced to community service and house arrest. The Lindsay that appeared in court looked different from the girl on movie posters. Her hair was still red, but her face was hardened. The world wasn't watching with affection anymore. It was watching to see how low she could go. Her probation violations stacked like dominoes, and each judge who saw her seemed a little less patient than the last. In between arrests, she tried to work. She filmed The Canyons, a low-budget thriller that would become infamous for its troubled production. Directors described her as unreliable, emotional, sometimes disappearing for days. When the film finally released, critics tore it apart. It was the end of her credibility in Hollywood. Yet beneath all the chaos, there was something almost tragic about her collapse. The system that made her also destroyed her. The paparazzi who followed her everywhere, the executives who exploited her fame, the fans who demanded entertainment from her pain. Lindsay wasn't a monster. She was a mirror. Years later in interviews, she'd talk about how fame at such a young age had warped her. She spoke of fear, loneliness, and the desperate need to be loved by millions while never feeling loved by anyone real. She said the parties were a way to fill the emptiness that fame couldn't fix. By the late 2010s, Lindsay Lohan had left the United States, living quietly in Dubai. She claimed sobriety, launched businesses, and even opened a beach club in Mykonos. She was no longer the punchline of late-night talk shows. The chaos had burned itself out. Today, her story stands not as one of murder or violence, but as one of self-destruction and survival. A different kind of crime, the slow killing of one's own potential under the weight of fame. She paid her dues not in years behind bars, but in years of public humiliation. Lindsay Lohan is still alive, still fighting for normalcy, but for a generation who grew up watching her rise and fall. She remains a living reminder that sometimes the worst crimes aren't the ones against others. They're the ones we commit against ourselves, when we lose sight of who we were before the world began watching. It was one of those cases that blurred the line between celebrity glamour and criminal intent, a story that proved fame could hide the darkest greed. Wesley Snipes wasn't the kind of star anyone expected to see in handcuffs. By the early 2000s, he was a household name, a martial artist, an action hero, the face of the Blade trilogy. His charisma and talent made him one of the few black leading men in Hollywood who'd truly broken through. But behind the scenes, Snipes had been playing a dangerous game with the U.S. government, one that would eventually cost him everything. It began quietly, years before anyone noticed. In the late 1990s, Snipes became involved with a group that promoted an unusual belief that income taxes were voluntary, that the U.S. government had no right to collect them. They called themselves tax protesters, and they built their argument on a tangle of pseudo-legal jargon and misinterpretations of constitutional law. Snipes, convinced by their theories, stopped filing federal tax returns altogether. The actor, who had earned millions through blockbuster films, began sending letters to the IRS declaring himself a non-resident alien. He claimed he owed nothing to the government and demanded refunds for the taxes he had previously paid. To the IRS, it wasn't just absurd, and it was criminal. From 1999 to 2004, Snipes made no legitimate tax filings. Instead, he submitted claims for tens of millions in refunds, using fraudulent paperwork prepared by his associates, Eddie Ray Kahn and Douglas P. Rosiel. It wasn't just an oversight or a simple case of evasion. It was a deliberate attempt to undermine the system. The IRS launched an investigation, and by 2006, federal prosecutors were building a case that would make headlines around the world. The indictment came in October of that year. 1 count of conspiracy to defraud the United States, 1 count of filing a false claim, and 6 counts of failing to file tax returns. The government alleged Snipes had evaded more than $7 million in taxes. The image of the movie star in a tailored suit, standing before a federal judge, became a symbol of arrogance. A man who thought he could outsmart the very system that made him rich. Snipes maintained his innocence. He claimed he'd been misled by Kahn and Rosiel, that he was a victim of bad advice and misunderstood beliefs. But prosecutors painted a different picture, one of deliberate deception and entitlement. They argued that Snipes had received numerous warnings from accountants, business managers, and even the IRS itself, yet ignored them all. The trial began in early 2008 in Ocala, Florida. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, and the media turned the case into a spectacle. Snipes' defense team argued that while he had made mistakes, he had no criminal intent, that his behavior was rooted in confusion, not conspiracy. The prosecution countered that Snipes had flaunted his celebrity status, believing it made him untouchable. In February 2008, the verdict came. The jury acquitted Snipes of the most serious charges, conspiracy and filing false claims, but convicted him on 3 misdemeanor counts of failing to file tax returns. It was a partial victory, but the punishment was still severe. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in federal prison, the maximum penalty for the charges. When Snipes was taken into custody in 2010, he was 48 years old. The Blade star, once a symbol of strength and power, now wore a prison uniform. He served his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in McKean, Pennsylvania. For nearly 3 years, his life was stripped of fame and freedom. In interviews after his release, Snipes tried to maintain dignity. He spoke about how prison had humbled him, how he'd spent his time reading, meditating, and focusing on spiritual growth. But the damage was already done. Hollywood had moved on. Studios no longer saw him as bankable, and the offers that did come were small. Supporting roles, direct-to-video projects, a shadow of what he once commanded. Still, Snipes never completely disappeared. He made a quiet return in films like The Expendables 3 and Coming to America. He even poked fun at his past in interviews, saying that he'd served his time like a man. But beneath the humor, there was bitterness, a lingering sense that the world had watched him fall with a kind of morbid satisfaction. In truth, Snipes' case became more than a celebrity scandal. It was a message. No matter how famous, how successful, or how rich, no one is above the law. The IRS made sure of that. His conviction was a warning to anyone who thought they could manipulate the system. But beyond the legal lesson, it was a story about ego, about what happens when power and paranoia collide. Wesley Snipes had built himself into a superhero on screen, but off-screen, he became a man who believed his fame could rewrite the rules. Years later, when fans look back, they remember his talent, his charisma, his undeniable presence. But they also remember the courtroom photographs, the look on his face as the verdict was read, the flashbulbs outside the courthouse, the sharp contrast between Hollywood lights and prison walls. He once said in an interview, "I was guilty of trusting the wrong people, but not of being a criminal." Maybe that was true. Or maybe it was just another line in a story about how the pursuit of wealth and freedom can lead even the strongest into captivity. Winona Ryder had the kind of fame most actors can only dream of. By the late 1990s, she was Hollywood royalty, the face of quirky intelligence and soft rebellion, the star of Heathers, Edward Scissorhands' Girl Interrupted. She had a reputation for choosing roles with depth, for bringing an authentic vulnerability to the screen that few could match. But in December 2001, her name stopped appearing in film headlines and started showing up in police blotters. It happened at Saks Fifth Avenue in Beverly Hills, one of those pristine, silent department stores where everything gleams under perfect lighting. Winona had entered with a personal shopper and a security escort, a common courtesy for celebrities. She browsed the designer racks, spoke politely with staff, and for over an hour appeared to be doing what any Hollywood A-lister might, trying on expensive clothes. But when she left the store, security detained her just steps outside. In her bags were over $5,500 worth of designer clothing and accessories, items she hadn't paid for. The image of Winona Ryder being handcuffed outside Saks was surreal. She didn't resist, didn't shout. She looked shocked, dazed even as cameras began flashing. Within hours, the story was everywhere. "Winona Ryder arrested for shoplifting," the headlines screamed. The public couldn't understand it. Why would someone with millions of dollars steal a few dresses? Police charged her with grand theft, burglary, and vandalism. When officers searched her belongings, they found prescription painkillers, oxycodone, Valium, and Vicodin, without a valid prescription. To the tabloids, it was gold. To Hollywood, it was scandal. Her trial began in 2002, and what emerged was a portrait of a woman under immense strain. The prosecution argued she deliberately cut off tags and concealed items. Surveillance footage showed her removing security sensors and placing clothes in a shopping bag. It was deliberate, they said, and not a mistake. But her defense told a different story. They claimed Winona was mentally fragile, that she'd been overprescribed medication following an injury, and that the drugs had clouded her judgment. The courtroom atmosphere was suffocating. Cameras weren't allowed, but every detail leaked. Her calm demeanor, her choice of modest black clothing, the way she avoided eye contact with the jury. Fans who had once seen her as Hollywood's cool girl now saw someone small, almost ghost-like. When the verdict came, she was found guilty of grand theft and vandalism, but not guilty of burglary. The judge sentenced her to 3 years of probation, 480 hours of community service, restitution to Saks Fifth Avenue, and fines totaling more than $10,000. It wasn't prison, but it might as well have been. Her career stopped overnight. Studios distanced themselves. Directors who once called her first stopped calling at all. The woman who had once stood next to Johnny Depp and Daniel Day-Lewis at award shows was now a Hollywood pariah. In interviews years later, Winona would admit that the period leading up to the arrest had been one of confusion and burnout. She'd been taking painkillers after injuring herself on a film set, and she described how they dulled her awareness of reality. She said she wasn't trying to steal. She was simply lost in a haze of dependency and exhaustion. But in 2001, that kind of vulnerability wasn't understood. Back then, celebrity downfall was treated as spectacle. The tabloids published her mugshot with cruel delight. Late-night hosts made jokes. But to those who looked closer, the case wasn't about theft. It was about a woman cracking under the weight of an industry that rewards perfection and punishes fragility. During her probation, Winona vanished. She stayed out of the spotlight, didn't take new roles, avoided interviews. Her silence became its own mystery. Was she broken or rebuilding? For nearly a decade, she lived like a ghost of her former self. Then quietly, the redemption began. In 2010, she reappeared in Darren Aronofsky's Black Swan. Her role, that of an aging ballerina replaced by a younger star, mirrored her real life in unsettling ways. Critics praised her performance. She wasn't trying to recapture her youth. She was embracing her scars. Years later, with Stranger Things, she found a second life. As Joyce Byers, the desperate, determined mother, she reminded the world what real acting looked like: raw, grounded, human. Audiences cheered her return, and even the press began rewriting her story, calling her a survivor of the Hollywood machine. But the Saks incident never truly faded. It remains one of the most inexplicable crimes in celebrity history, not because of its scale, but because of its sadness. It wasn't greed. It wasn't malice. It was a moment of collapse, a quiet act of rebellion against a life that no longer felt real. When people remember Winona Ryder now, they think of her eyes, those wide, searching eyes that could convey innocence, terror, or sorrow all at once. In 2001, those same eyes stared out from a mugshot that shocked the world. And maybe that's why her story still resonates, because it forced everyone to see the person behind the fame. Today, she speaks of the arrest without bitterness. "That time saved me," she once said. "It gave me the break I didn't know I needed." And maybe that's the truest ending, that in losing everything, she found a way to start again, not as a movie star, but as herself. It's hard to imagine the man who once made millions laugh being led away in handcuffs. But the fall of Bill Cosby was unlike anything the entertainment industry had ever seen. For decades, he had been America's father, the gentle, sweater-wearing patriarch of The Cosby Show, a symbol of decency, family, and integrity. He was the man who sold Jell-O pudding with a smile and stood as a role model for generations of Black Americans, a pioneer who broke barriers in comedy and television. But beneath the surface of that wholesome image, there was a pattern of cruelty that would take half a century to fully emerge. The first public crack appeared in 2005, when Andrea Constand, a staff member at Temple University, accused Cosby of drugging and sexually assaulting her at his home in Pennsylvania the previous year. She described how he'd offered her pills that made her dizzy, then violated her while she was unable to move. It was shocking, but few believed her at the time. Cosby was too beloved, too powerful, too untouchable. The case was settled out of court in 2006 for an undisclosed sum, and the story faded, at least for a while. Then, nearly a decade later, the truth began to pour out. It started with a viral moment in 2014, comedian Hannibal Buress performing a stand-up set in Philadelphia, calling Cosby out by name, reminding the audience that the so-called family man had been accused of being a rapist. The clip spread like wildfire, reigniting long-buried allegations. One woman after another began to speak publicly, not 2 or 3, but dozens. By the end, more than 60 women came forward, each with disturbingly similar stories. Cosby would invite them to his home or hotel, offer a drink or pill to help them relax, and then assault them while they were incapacitated. For years, the industry had looked the other way. His fame had shielded him, his image had silenced victims. But now, in the age of social media and a changing cultural climate, the voices could no longer be ignored. In 2015, Cosby was charged with aggravated indecent assault against Andrea Constand, the one case still within the statute of limitations. His 2005 deposition, once sealed, was released. In it, Cosby admitted to obtaining quaaludes to give to women he wanted to have sex with. It was a moment that shattered any remaining illusion of innocence. The first trial in 2017 ended in a mistrial after the jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision. But the second trial in 2018 was different. The courtroom was tense, filled with reporters, victims, and curious spectators. 5 additional women were allowed to testify, painting a horrifying pattern of predation. Cosby sat silently, often expressionless, as decades of hidden violence were laid bare. When the verdict was read, guilty on all 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault, the air in the courtroom seemed to shift. A man once called America's dad was now a convicted felon. At age 81, Bill Cosby was sentenced to 3 to 10 years in state prison, labeled a sexually violent predator, and ordered to undergo lifetime counseling. For his victims, it was a rare moment of justice after years of disbelief and humiliation. For the world, it was a reckoning, proof that even the most beloved icons could hide monstrous secrets. Cosby's fall marked a cultural turning point, one that coincided with the rise of the Me Too movement. It forced Hollywood to confront the reality that charisma and fame could conceal abuse. Inside prison, Cosby maintained his innocence. He called his conviction a political lynching. His legal team appealed, arguing procedural errors and constitutional violations. And in a controversial twist in 2021, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned his conviction, ruling that a previous non-prosecution agreement had been violated. Cosby was released after serving nearly 3 years. The reaction was divided. Supporters celebrated his release, calling it vindication. His accusers, and much of the public, saw it as a technicality that let a guilty man go free. Cosby returned home, blind, frail, and largely ostracized from the industry he had once dominated. He remains defiant to this day, giving interviews that suggest no remorse. But the damage is permanent. His legacy, once defined by laughter and family values, is now inseparable from his crimes. The Cosby Show still exists, frozen in reruns and memories, but it plays differently now. Every laugh tinged with unease, every fatherly smile carrying the weight of betrayal. For those who grew up idolizing him, the realization was devastating. He wasn't just another fallen celebrity. He was proof that evil can hide behind warmth, that the most trusted face can mask the darkest soul. In the end, Bill Cosby's story isn't about scandal. It's about deception on a national scale. A man who built his reputation on morality, who told others how to live, used that image as a weapon. And when it all came crashing down, it left behind not just ruined victims, but a nation forced to question how easily it had believed in the illusion of innocence. O.J. Simpson had everything: talent, charm, money, and fame. To many, he was the American dream made flesh. A poor kid from San Francisco who became a football legend, a movie star, and a symbol of success that transcended race. But on a warm June night in 1994, all of that shattered in a storm of blood, flashing lights, and disbelief. The man who had once been a hero was suddenly the most infamous suspect in the country. The story began with a brutal double homicide in the wealthy neighborhood of Brentwood, Los Angeles. Nicole Brown Simpson, O.J.'s ex-wife, and her friend Ronald Goldman were found murdered outside Nicole's townhouse. The scene was horrifying. Blood pooled across the steps. The victim stabbed multiple times in a frenzy of rage. Within hours, police began to suspect O.J. There was blood on his driveway, a bloody glove found at the crime scene that matched one discovered at his home, and a trail of evidence that seemed impossible to explain away. On June 17, 1994, when Simpson failed to turn himself in, he became the center of one of the most famous police pursuits in history. Millions watched live as a white Ford Bronco crept down the Los Angeles freeway, O.J. inside with a gun to his head. Helicopters followed, reporters narrated in real time, and the entire nation stopped. Offices, schools, restaurants, all eyes fixed on one man running from justice. The chase ended peacefully, with O.J. returning home and surrendering. But the trial that followed became more than a criminal proceeding. It was a cultural earthquake. The prosecution believed the evidence was ironclad, DNA matched, blood spatter connected him to the scene, and domestic abuse allegations painted a picture of a violent man. The defense, led by Johnny Cochran, crafted a narrative that turned the case into a referendum on race, policing, and celebrity. For 9 months, the world watched the so-called trial of the century. Every detail was televised: the arguments, the witnesses, the outbursts. The defense argued that the Los Angeles Police Department had planted evidence that racist officers like Mark Fuhrman had framed O.J. When Fuhrman's taped use of racial slurs came to light, it changed everything. The jury, composed mostly of black citizens, began to see the trial not as a murder case, but as a symbol of systemic injustice. Then came the glove. Prosecutors asked O.J. to try on the bloody leather glove found at the scene. Before the cameras, he struggled, flexing his fingers, shaking his head. "It doesn't fit," Cochran told the jury. "You must acquit." It became one of the most famous lines in legal history, and it worked. On October 3, 1995, the verdict was read: not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Outside, crowds cheered or wept, depending on which America they belonged to. For some, it was justice served after years of racist policing. For others, it was the moment celebrity power triumphed over truth. Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman's family sat in silence, their faces drained of all hope. But O.J.'s freedom didn't last long in peace. Though acquitted criminally, he was later found liable for wrongful death in a civil suit filed by the victims' families. The judgment cost him $33.5 million, money he would never fully pay. His life spiraled downward. Endorsement deals vanished. Hollywood shut its doors. He became a living ghost, wandering between interviews, book deals, and controversy. Then, in 2007, O.J.'s name hit the headlines again. This time it wasn't about murder. In Las Vegas, he led a group of men into a hotel room to reclaim sports memorabilia he claimed had been stolen from him. The confrontation turned violent. Armed men ordered people to the floor. It was caught on tape. O.J. was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including armed robbery and kidnapping. In 2008, he was found guilty and sentenced to 33 years in prison, with parole possible after 9. It was a bitter irony. O.J. Simpson had walked free after one of the most notorious murders in history, only to end up behind bars over sports memorabilia. He served 9 years before being released on parole in 2017. When he walked out of Lovelock Correctional Center in Nevada, he was 70 years old, gray, slower, but still carrying that strange mix of arrogance and denial. He continued to insist he'd done nothing wrong in either case. To some, he was still a fallen hero. To others, a murderer who had escaped justice once too often. O.J. spent his final years quietly in Las Vegas, posting occasional videos online, smiling as if trying to convince the world, and maybe himself, that he was at peace. But peace was never something O.J. Simpson could have. The murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman never faded. Their names lingered longer than his fame ever could. When O.J. died in 2024, reactions were split. Some remembered the athlete, the record breaker, the man who once represented possibility. Others remembered the blood, the trial, the glove that didn't fit. For most, his name remained synonymous with the corruption of fame, the reminder that charisma and celebrity can't erase the truth written in blood. His life had been a performance from start to finish. A smiling face for the cameras, a double life behind the lens, and finally a courtroom drama that revealed how America itself was divided. O.J. Simpson wanted to be loved, to be remembered as a legend. He will be remembered, but not for what he wanted. Phil Spector was a genius, a musical architect who changed the sound of pop forever. In the 1960s, he built walls of sound so dense and hypnotic that even the Beatles sought his touch. He produced anthems like Be My Baby, You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin', and Let It Be. His name was whispered in studios with reverence. But behind that wall of sound was another kind of wall, one of paranoia, violence, and control. And eventually, it would become a prison of his own making. In the decades following his success, Spector's brilliance turned darker. He became a recluse in his Los Angeles mansion, a bizarre, fortress-like castle in Alhambra. Friends and collaborators described his behavior as unpredictable. He carried guns constantly, waving them around at recording sessions, threatening artists when he felt disrespected. Those who worked with him said he was a man haunted by his own demons, drugs, alcohol, and a crushing need to dominate everyone around him. Then came February 3, 2003, the night when genius finally crossed into tragedy. That evening, Spector went out to the House of Blues in West Hollywood. There he met 40-year-old actress Lana Clarkson, who worked as a hostess at the venue. Lana had once been a rising star, appearing in cult films during the 1980s, but fame had faded. She was known for her humor and kindness, but that night she seemed flattered by Spector's attention. Witnesses saw the two leave together in Spector's chauffeur-driven Mercedes around 2 a.m., heading back to his mansion. The driver, Adriano de Souza, waited outside. About an hour later, de Souza heard a loud pop. Moments later, Spector emerged from the house, gun in hand, his white jacket stained with blood. "I think I killed somebody," he muttered. Inside the foyer, Lana Clarkson's body was slumped in a chair. A single gunshot had entered her mouth and exited the back of her head. Blood had splattered across the furniture. The .38 revolver rested at her feet. It looked, at first glance, like suicide, until police examined the evidence. The gun was wiped clean. Spector's DNA was on the weapon, and blood spatter indicated he was standing close when the shot was fired. Spector was arrested, but true to form, he claimed innocence. "She kissed the gun," he said, an explanation so bizarre it became a headline. He insisted Lana had taken her own life. But forensic experts disagreed. The gun was too far back, the trajectory too specific, the handling too careful. There were also witnesses, women who came forward to testify that Spector had a history of pulling guns on them when they tried to leave his home. It took 6 years for the trial to conclude. The first one in 2007 ended in a hung jury. The defense painted Spector as an eccentric old man, harmless and misunderstood. The prosecution, however, built a pattern of behavior that showed a man obsessed with control. The second trial, in 2009, left no room for doubt. The jury found Phil Spector guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 19 years to life in prison. For the first time, the man who built walls of sound was now behind real ones. From his cell, Spector remained defiant. He claimed he was the victim of a setup, that the media had destroyed him. His lawyers tried appeals, but the evidence was overwhelming. He grew frail in prison, his once flamboyant hair replaced by a pale, receding scalp. He gave few interviews, but in those he did, he spoke more about his legacy than his crime. A man still obsessed with being remembered as a genius, not a killer. Lana Clarkson's family never forgot. Her mother described her as a woman full of life and potential, someone who had fought her way through Hollywood's cruelty. Her death became another symbol of how power and fame often shield dangerous men, until it doesn't. Phil Spector died in 2021, still behind bars. The obituaries that followed were conflicted, half about his genius, half about his madness. The Guardian called him a brilliant producer and convicted murderer. It was the perfect summary of his life, a duality that could never be reconciled. The mansion where Lana Clarkson died still stands, though it's changed hands many times. Those who visited describe it as eerie, silent, as if the echoes of the past still vibrate within its walls. Perhaps that's fitting. Phil Spector once said that music was eternal, that his sound would outlive him. He was right. But so would the memory of the crime that ended his freedom. It's a chilling reminder that genius doesn't excuse cruelty. For every note Spector ever layered, there was always a darker rhythm beneath it, the sound of a man who couldn't bear to lose control. Robert Blake had the kind of Hollywood career most actors only dream about. He started as a child star in the 1930s, appearing in the Our Gang comedies, and grew into a respected adult actor known for his intensity and realism. His biggest success came in the 1970s with the TV series Beretta, where he played a tough, street-smart detective who lived by his own rules. But behind that gritty charm was a man whose personal life was unraveling. A man who would one day stand accused of orchestrating a murder that sounded more like a movie script than reality. By the early 2000s, Blake's fame had long faded. He lived quietly in Los Angeles, his glory days behind him. In 1999, at 66 years old, he met a woman named Bonnie Lee Backley. Bonnie was a small-time actress and grifter with a long history of conning older, wealthy men, often celebrities, into relationships. She had multiple aliases, used fake names, and ran what police later called a lonely hearts scam, marrying men for money and security. Despite warnings from friends, Blake became involved with her. Their relationship was toxic from the start, filled with accusations, mistrust, and manipulation. When Bonnie became pregnant, Blake insisted on a DNA test to confirm he was the father. It came back positive. Their daughter, Rose, was born in 2000. Reluctantly, Blake married Bonnie, but even close friends said he seemed disgusted by the situation. He often complained that she had trapped him. Then came May 4, 2001, a night that would change everything. Blake and Bonnie went out to dinner at Vitello's, an Italian restaurant in Studio City that the actor often frequented. After dinner, the two walked back to Blake's car, which was parked a block away. Blake later told police that when they reached the car, he realized he'd left his gun inside the restaurant and went back to retrieve it. When he returned, he found Bonnie slumped in the passenger seat, shot once in the head. The window was shattered, her body still strapped in by the seatbelt. Police quickly grew suspicious. The story didn't make sense. Why would a man leave his wife alone in a car late at night in that area? And why did he forget a gun inside the restaurant? One that, conveniently, wasn't the murder weapon. Investigators soon discovered that Blake owned several firearms and had allegedly asked acquaintances in the weeks prior if they knew anyone who could take care of a problem. Two stuntmen who had worked with Blake came forward, claiming the actor had approached them about killing his wife. Both refused, thinking he was joking. But the prosecution argued it wasn't a joke. It was premeditation. In April 2002, nearly a year after the murder, Robert Blake was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation of murder. The trial began in late 2004, and Hollywood once again became a courtroom theater. Blake's defense argued there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. The murder weapon, a .38 caliber revolver, was found in a nearby dumpster, but it had no fingerprints. No witnesses saw him pull the trigger. The defense portrayed Blake as a victim, an old, lonely man manipulated by a scheming woman. The prosecution painted him as a cold, calculating killer who wanted out of a marriage he despised. It was a battle of perception. Celebrity versus con artist, and the jury was caught between two lives that had both been shaped by deceit. After months of testimony, the verdict came in March 2005, not guilty of murder. The jury said the evidence was circumstantial, the timeline too uncertain. Blake collapsed in tears as the verdict was read. But justice didn't end there. In 2005, Bonnie Lee Backley's family filed a civil lawsuit against Blake for wrongful death. Unlike the criminal trial, the standard of proof was lower. The jury in that case found Blake liable for Backley's death and ordered him to pay $30 million in damages, later reduced to $15 million on appeal. The verdict effectively ruined him. He filed for bankruptcy, sold his belongings, and retreated from public life. Interviews in later years revealed a man both bitter and broken. "I'm broke," he told one journalist. "I'm 85 years old and I don't know how I'm still alive." Robert Blake spent his final years living quietly, estranged from most of Hollywood and his own family. When he died in 2023 at age 89, his passing was met with silence. No tributes, no retrospectives, just a brief mention in the news. Bonnie Lee Backley's story, too, faded from headlines, her life remembered more for its tragic end than its turbulent path. But for those who followed the case, it remained one of Hollywood's darkest tales, a story of two people drawn together by greed, desperation, and self-destruction. Robert Blake once played a detective who said, "Don't do the crime if you can't do the time." In the end, he never did the time, but the court of public opinion had long since found him guilty. Winona Ryder was once Hollywood's darling, the face of a generation in the 1990s. With roles in Edward Scissorhands' Heathers and Girl, Interrupted, she had that rare ability to seem both fragile and rebellious, a combination that made her one of the most sought-after actresses of her time. But by the early 2000s, that image would be shattered in an unexpected way. Not by scandal or violence, but by something far more human and strangely trivial: shoplifting. It was December 12, 2001, a chilly afternoon in Beverly Hills. Ryder walked into the upscale Saks Fifth Avenue store, dressed in designer clothes, blending easily among the elite clientele. Security cameras showed her browsing through aisles, selecting armfuls of luxury items: handbags, scarves, hair accessories, clothing. But what struck the guards watching the footage wasn't what she bought. It was what she slipped into her bag without paying. By the time she reached the door, Ryder had more than $5,000 worth of merchandise concealed on her. Store security stopped her before she could leave. What followed was surreal. The woman who had once embodied sophistication and fame was now being detained like any ordinary thief. Police were called, and she was arrested on the spot. The mugshot that followed, Winona's pale, stunned face framed by her dark hair, became one of the most talked-about images of the decade. The case went public instantly. News anchors and tabloids feasted on it. For weeks, her name dominated headlines, not for a new film or award nomination, but for stealing designer clothes. Many wondered why someone so rich, so famous, would risk everything over something so trivial. Was it kleptomania, a cry for help, or just the pressure of a collapsing career? As the trial began, Ryder's defense tried to frame the incident as a misunderstanding. They argued that she had been under the influence of prescription drugs, suffering from extreme anxiety and depression. Her lawyers claimed she was disoriented and didn't realize what she was doing. But the prosecution painted a different picture, of a calculated theft, supported by clear surveillance footage and testimony from store employees who said she had used scissors to remove security tags. In November 2002, the verdict came down. Winona Ryder was found guilty of grand theft and vandalism. The punishment was far lighter than the humiliation she had already endured. 3 years of probation, 80 hours of community service, and fines totaling around $10,000. But in Hollywood, reputation is currency, and hers had been spent. Studios pulled away. Endorsements vanished. Directors stopped calling. It was as though her name had become toxic overnight. In the years that followed, Ryder disappeared from the public eye. She retreated to Northern California, avoiding interviews and public appearances. There were no arrests, no dramatic breakdowns, just silence. But quietly, something began to shift. The public, once cruelly amused, began to empathize. People started to see the case not as a crime of greed, but as a moment of collapse. The act of a woman under immense pressure, cracking under the weight of fame. Winona eventually returned to acting, slowly rebuilding her career. Her comeback came in 2016 with Stranger Things, where she played Joyce Byers, a mother unraveling under stress, fiercely trying to hold her world together. The role mirrored her own life in uncanny ways, and audiences embraced her again. Still, the shadow of that Saks Fifth Avenue incident never completely disappeared. It became a permanent chapter in her story, a symbol of how quickly fame can turn from light to darkness. When asked about it years later, she didn't deny her mistake. "I was in a very weird time in my life," she said. "I just remember feeling so broken, and I didn't know how to ask for help." Her honesty struck a chord. Unlike others who tried to rewrite their wrongs, Winona owned hers. The same vulnerability that once made her beloved was now what made her human again. Today, her story stands as a cautionary tale, not of crime and punishment, but of pressure and identity. The shoplifting case that once threatened to end her career ultimately became the thing that defined her resilience. Winona Ryder didn't kill anyone. She didn't hurt anyone. She just made a mistake, one that the world wouldn't let her forget. But through it all, she proved that redemption, though slow and fragile, is possible even after public disgrace. And perhaps that's why audiences forgave her, because in her fall they saw something familiar. Not celebrity, not scandal, but humanity. Mark Wahlberg is one of Hollywood's biggest success stories, an Oscar-nominated actor, producer, and businessman who rose from the streets of Boston to global fame. But long before The Departed, Ted, or Transformers, before the celebrity image and the polished charm, there was another Mark, a violent teenager with a criminal record and a past many fans still find hard to reconcile with the man he became. Back in the 1980s, Wahlberg wasn't known for his movies. He was known to local police. Growing up in Dorchester, a rough neighborhood of Boston, Mark was the youngest of 9 children in a working-class family. By age 13, he had dropped out of school and fallen deep into crime, stealing cars, using drugs, and getting into brutal street fights. But the darkest chapter came when he was just 16 years old. On April 8, 1988, Wahlberg attacked 2 Vietnamese men during a night of violence fueled by drugs and racism. According to police reports, Mark struck one man, Thanh Lam, in the head with a wooden stick, knocking him unconscious. Later that same night, he punched another man, Hoa Trinh, in the eye while yelling racial slurs. Both victims survived, but the attack left permanent scars, physical and psychological. When police arrested Wahlberg later that night, he reportedly laughed, believing he'd get away with it. But the evidence was undeniable. He was charged with attempted murder, later reduced to assault and battery after plea negotiations. In court, Wahlberg admitted to the attacks but insisted he had changed. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, though he served just 45 days at the Deer Island House of Correction. For most people, that might have been the end. Another angry young man lost to the system. But for Mark, prison became a turning point. He later said it was the first time he realized the reality of his life, that he was either going to die on the streets or spend his life behind bars. When he got out, he vowed to change. Still, redemption was not immediate. Wahlberg returned to the streets, but this time channeling his energy into something different: music. Under the guidance of his older brother, Donnie, a member of New Kids on the Block, Mark reinvented himself as Marky Mark, frontman of the early 1990s hip-hop group Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. Their single Good Vibrations shot to #1, and suddenly the ex-convict from Boston was a pop star. But fame couldn't fully erase the past. Even as his music career boomed, Wahlberg was haunted by his history. Old police reports resurfaced, painting a picture of a young man involved in multiple racially motivated incidents, throwing rocks at black school children, hurling insults at minorities. It was a side of his life that Hollywood preferred not to discuss. When Wahlberg transitioned into acting in the mid-1990s, starting with Boogie Nights and Three Kings, he began to craft a new public identity, that of a reformed man. and for many years he avoided direct discussion of his crimes. But as his fame grew, so did the scrutiny. In 2014, Wahlberg made headlines again when he filed a request for a pardon from the Massachusetts Board of Pardons, hoping to have his criminal record erased. The move sparked outrage. Many argued that erasing his past would erase the pain of his victims, that wealth and fame shouldn't buy forgiveness. Tan Lam and Hoa Trin both spoke publicly, expressing mixed feelings. One forgave him. The other said he hadn't done enough to make amends. Facing backlash, Wahlberg withdrew the application, admitting that true redemption couldn't come from paperwork. "I don't need a piece of paper to acknowledge that I've turned my life around," he said later. "I just want to do good, help others, and live differently." And in many ways he did. Wahlberg became one of Hollywood's most bankable stars, built a business empire, and started a foundation supporting at-risk youth, the kind of kids he once was. He has spoken candidly about faith, discipline, and gratitude, often emphasizing how close he came to throwing everything away. Yet the shadow of that 1988 night still lingers. Every few years, when new generations rediscover the story, it becomes a reminder of how complicated human transformation really is. Can someone truly atone for violence? Can fame ever separate a man from his past? Mark Wahlberg himself has said that he wakes up every day trying to prove he's not that kid anymore. For some, his efforts, his philanthropy, his humility are proof enough. For others, the stain of what he did can never completely fade. But the story of Mark Wahlberg is not one of denial. It's one of reckoning. A man who once used hate as his weapon now uses his platform to preach change. He's proof that redemption doesn't erase the past. It only means you choose to carry it differently. In the end, his legacy will always be divided between the kid who nearly blinded a man and the man who built a career trying to see the world more clearly. Lindsay Lohan's story is one of Hollywood's most tragic paradoxes. A child star who seemed destined for greatness, but instead became a cautionary tale of fame, addiction, and self-destruction. She was once the face of innocence and talent, the kind of actress who could light up a screen without saying a word. But as quickly as she rose, she fell. And when she fell, the entire world watched. Born in New York in 1986, Lindsay was acting and modeling by the age of 3. Her breakthrough came in 1998 when she starred in Disney's The Parent Trap, playing both twins in a performance so confident and charming that critics compared her to a young Jodie Foster. From there, her career skyrocketed. Freaky Friday, Mean Girls, Herbie, Fully Loaded, each hit making her one of Hollywood's most bankable young stars. But behind the success was chaos. Her parents, Michael and Dina Lohan, were locked in a toxic relationship filled with public fights and financial battles. Lindsay became the family's main source of income, carrying the weight of their dysfunction while trying to live as a teenager under the spotlight. By the time she turned 18, she was rich, famous, and completely unprotected. The first cracks appeared in 2005. Reports of missed rehearsals, partying, and exhaustion began surfacing on film sets. Co-stars and directors described her as talented but unreliable. Then the arrests began. On May 26, 2007, police pulled Lindsay over in Beverly Hills after she lost control of her Mercedes and crashed into a curb. Officers found cocaine in the car. She was charged with DUI, cocaine possession, and driving with a suspended license. She checked into rehab soon after, her first of many stays. But within 2 months, she was arrested again, this time after chasing another woman's car in a drunken rage. Once again, cocaine and alcohol were involved. Lindsay pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges and accepted a plea deal: 1 day in jail, community service, and mandatory rehab. She served just 84 minutes before being released due to overcrowding, a decision that would haunt her public image. But she couldn't stay out of trouble. Between 2007 and 2010, Lohan was arrested or jailed multiple times for probation violations, failed drug tests, and skipping court-ordered classes. Each time she swore she'd changed. Each time the headlines returned: Lohan back in rehab, Lohan misses court date, Lohan sentenced again. By 2011, the girl who had once been America's sweetheart was now Hollywood's most famous cautionary tale. Directors stopped calling. Studios dropped her. Tabloids turned her life into a circus, capturing every mugshot, every courtroom appearance, every tearful apology. In one of her lowest moments, she was sentenced to 120 days in jail for stealing a $20,500 necklace from a boutique in Venice, California. Surveillance footage showed her trying on the jewelry, smiling, then simply walking out with it. Lohan claimed it was a misunderstanding, that she'd been loaned the piece, but the jury didn't buy it. The theft wasn't about money. It was about chaos, about the impulsive spiral of someone who no longer understood consequence. Yet through all of this, there were flashes of the old Lindsay, the talented actress, the charismatic presence who could still own a screen. Even judges seemed to sense it. "You're not like the others," one told her during sentencing. "You can fix this, but you have to stop lying to yourself." After multiple stints in rehab, a few failed comebacks, and several attempts to restart her career, Lindsay left Los Angeles altogether. She moved to Europe, living in London, then Dubai, far from paparazzi and courtroom drama. She reinvented herself quietly, appearing in occasional films and even opening a beach club in Greece. In 2023, something extraordinary happened. Lindsay Lohan became a mother. She announced the birth of her son, Louis, and with that, her story took a turn toward peace. "He changed everything," she said in an interview. "He gave me a reason to stay grounded." It's easy to look at Lindsay's past and see only the scandal, the mugshots, the late-night arrests, the wasted potential. But to understand her story is to understand how fame can devour a person. She was a child raised in cameras, celebrated and exploited in equal measure, and punished when she fell apart under a pressure no one could survive. Lindsay Lohan is no longer the girl from Mean Girls, nor the woman from the tabloids. She's someone who lived through the worst version of fame and somehow made it out alive. Her life is both a warning and a testament that redemption doesn't always mean return, and survival itself can be the greatest victory. Because sometimes the biggest crime in Hollywood isn't what you do, it's how the world treats you when you break. Armie Hammer was born into privilege, the great-grandson of oil tycoon Armand Hammer, raised in wealth, charisma, and expectation. From the outside, he seemed like the embodiment of Hollywood's golden image. Tall, articulate, handsome, and seemingly untouched by scandal. But behind the camera-ready smile was a life that would unravel in a way no one could have imagined. A story of obsession, control, and allegations that would destroy everything he'd built. For years, Hammer was a symbol of refinement and potential. He broke through in The Social Network, 2010, playing the Winklevoss twins, charming, competitive, and perfectly polished. Then came Call Me by Your Name, the 2017 film that made him a global star and an Oscar darling. He was the kind of actor Hollywood adored, old-fashioned good looks with modern sensibility. To the public, he was a family man, married to journalist and TV personality Elizabeth Chambers, with 2 young children. But in early 2021, that image shattered overnight. It started with a series of leaked private messages, posted anonymously online by women who claimed to have had relationships with Hammer. The messages were graphic, detailing fantasies of domination, violence, and even cannibalism. Screenshots circulated across social media, painting a picture of a man whose private desires veered into the grotesque. Hammer dismissed the claims at first, calling them vicious and spurious. But soon, multiple women came forward publicly with their own stories. They described relationships that began with charm and affection, but quickly turned controlling and abusive. One woman, identified only as Effie, accused Hammer of violently raping her in 2017, claiming he mentally manipulated her throughout a 4-year affair. Others described disturbing experiences, branding, physical harm, and emotional coercion, all wrapped in what they said was Hammer's obsession with power. As the accusations spread, Hollywood recoiled. Projects were canceled overnight. Hammer was dropped from Shotgun Wedding alongside Jennifer Lopez. His talent agency CAA dropped him, and his publicist resigned. Even his upcoming roles in The Offer and Billion Dollar Spy were quietly recast. The once celebrated actor had become radioactive. Hammer went silent. Then came the investigation. In March 2021, the Los Angeles Police Department confirmed it was looking into the rape allegation. Hammer denied every claim, insisting that all his relationships had been consensual, part of what he called mutually agreed-upon role play. But the public tide had turned. The damage was done. In 2022, a discovery shook the industry even further. House of Hammer, a 3-part documentary, aired on Discovery Plus, featuring interviews with several of his accusers and with members of his own family, who described a long lineage of secrecy, violence, and moral decay. His aunt, Casey Hammer, called the family a dynasty built on dysfunction. It was as if Army's fall wasn't just personal. It was generational, the latest in a legacy of corruption disguised as success. While prosecutors ultimately decided not to file formal charges in 2023 due to insufficient evidence, Hammer's career was effectively over. The court of public opinion had made its decision long before the legal one. Studios wouldn't touch him. His marriage to Elizabeth Chambers ended in divorce. Reports surfaced that he was living quietly in the Cayman Islands, working as a timeshare salesman, a bizarre, almost cinematic contrast to the life he once led on red carpets. In a rare interview that year, Hammer admitted to being suicidal after the scandal broke. "I was on the verge of ending it all," he said. "I had to sit with who I'd become." He also revealed that he had been sexually abused at 13, a confession that complicated the narrative but didn't erase it. Today, Armie Hammer lives in the margins of a world that once adored him. His name, once printed in bold on movie posters, now lingers as a whispered cautionary tale. Was he a predator hiding behind charm, or a man consumed by self-destruction and indulgence? The truth, as with many Hollywood stories, may never be fully known. What remains undeniable is the fall itself. How quickly fame can evaporate when darkness emerges from behind the mask. For some, Hammer's story is proof that privilege and beauty can hide depravity. For others, it's a study in the machinery of fame, how it elevates, exploits, and abandons its own. Either way, the man who once played princes and lovers became a symbol of ruin. The same camera that once adored him now records only absence. And in that silence, Armie Hammer stands as one more reminder that in Hollywood, image is everything, until it isn't. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments.